English 102 requires you to be an active learner, far more than many other composition classes, in my opinion. The reason for that is that we are familiar with most of the concepts that you're going to learn in English 102. You've already heard about all of these things, or at least most of them. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the difference between being familiar with the concept, understanding a concept, and then actually being able to apply it with some degree of skill. So I like to consider this as being something like a progress bar when you're making a purchase online. You have different steps in the process, but unless you click Make Purchase, you have not completed the entire transaction. So familiarity is the most basic aspect of understanding. It means we're familiar with the concept. We've heard it before, and we have a vague sense of maybe what it means. But that's very different from understanding a concept. Understanding a concept means not only that you've heard of it before, but that you also have a good sense of when it's important and what's required of you when you're using this concept, and maybe to some extent how to at least get a first attempt of performing some of these actions. And that's very different from skillful application. Skillful application is what we're aiming for with all of the skills in the student learning outcome chart that you've been looking at in your packets. It's one thing to be familiar with them, it's another thing to understand them, but what we're really aiming for is skillful application. And this is important for a couple of reasons. There is a natural human tendency when we're familiar with a concept to relax a little bit and perhaps pay less attention. When we feel like we understand a concept, we're likely to even relax more, maybe even push fast forward if we're watching a video, or skim if we're reading. But neither of these stages of understanding are sufficient for being successful in English 102. You have to get to the point where you're skillfully applying the processes that we talk about, the documentation strategies, the research strategies, etc. And the other thing that makes this important is that all of us, everyone in our class, has different strengths and weaknesses. So for some of you, the idea of writing a 10-page paper is terrifying, right? You're nervous about having enough to say. There are other students who have no worries about having enough to say, but they're really concerned about being able to get the documentation right. There are others who have no concern about either of those things, but they can't spell for the life of them, and that's their major anxiety in this class. So for all of us, we have these different little potholes, I'll call them. Imagine this being a little road, and we all want to go down this road, and we want to be successful and move on to the rest of our college careers. But if we have a problem with documentation, and we don't really pay attention enough to learn this skill and practice it, engage in the workshops and get feedback on it, you could hit this pothole and it could derail your attempt to get to the end of the class. Perhaps you have that as your only real problem, and you confront it again here, no problem, you've kind of filled in the edges of that pothole, and there you go. By the end, you've got it all pretty much figured out. Maybe there's some bumps at the edges of it. Maybe you have to slow down because you know that this pothole was pretty recently patched, right? But you can still drive over it and move on through the rest of your college career. Doing this requires you to be aware that you're just familiar with something or just understanding it, not quite applying it skillfully yet. We want to make sure that every single one of these potholes that you have, whether it's a documentation pothole, whether it is a spelling issue, whether it's a full development of ideas issue, whether it's paragraph organization, which is a big one with very hard edges, we want to make sure that you at the very least have filled in these road hazards basically in the composition process and have smoothed out the edges sufficiently that while you may have to pay extra attention, you may have to go back a second time and take a little more care as you go through it. You may have to slow down a little bit. You're nonetheless able to practice all of these things with skill. And that's our goal here. So as you're reading the lessons, watching the videos, make sure you're asking yourself, do I understand this? Am I just familiar with it? Do I know how to do it?